This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. In this episode, I speak with the writer Srinivas Rao. He talks to me about creativity and curiosity, his daily routines, systems versus goals, and the importance of Keystone habits. Enjoy this episode. Hey, it's James Taylor here. I'm delighted today to have Srini Rao. Srini Rao is the host and founder of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where he's conducted over 600 interviews with thought leaders and creative entrepreneurs, including Tim Ferriss, Seth Godin, and Simon Sinek. These interviews have given him a unique insight into what creates remarkable branding, storytelling, and marketing. He is also the author of 2 books. His first, being The Art of Being Unmistakable, was a Wall Street Times bestseller, while his latest, Unmistakable, inspires readers to create their own path and define their own success. It's my great pleasure to have Srini on the show today. Welcome, Srini.
Thanks, James, for having me.
So share with our listeners, what's going on in your world just now?
Well, let's see. Some of what you've just mentioned. I just had a book come out called Unmistakable, Why Only is Better Than Best with Penguin Portfolio. I've been running this show called The Unmistakable Creative, where at this point I've probably done close to 700 interviews with some of the people that you mentioned. But in my opinion, the more interesting ones are the people that probably nobody's ever heard of before. I pride myself on finding unusual guests. So we've had, in addition to sort of the household names like Simon Sinek, Seth Godin, and Tim Ferriss, we've had bank robbers and drug dealers and performance psychologists. And, we had a guy who spent years in a cult and talked to me about the psychology of cult formation. So I think the sort of underlying thread to all my work really is 2 things, maybe. There are 2 threads. One is this idea of unmistakable, the idea of, how do you do something that is so distinctive that nobody else could have done but you in the way that you've done it. And then, of course, the other one is curiosity, which I think is really kind of, to me, I think at the heart of any creative endeavor of any sort is curiosity. I think when you make what you want to see exist in the world, you have, the ability to, as Neil Gaiman says, create work that doesn't let you down. Whereas I think what happens, so often in the world that we live in today, especially because our lives are so publicly on display and we can see what every single person is tweeting or Facebooking or Instagramming, they've got these, beautifully, thoroughly edited, curated versions of their lives that we think are their real lives, and we compare our actual lives with their edited lives. And so as a result, we actually, go into the space of a comparison and envy, and those things are very toxic for creativity. So I think the other thread to sort of, make the point is curiosity is really kind of a big part of what I do. And then, of course, I'm also a speaker as well.
And then it's interesting, with having spoken to all these 700 people, obviously I'm imagining you've learned a huge amount. Your listeners would have learned a huge amount about, the guest, the bank robbers and everyone in between. But what have you learned about yourself as an individual, as a creative, as a person from doing that?
That's a really great question, because so many people ask me, what have you learned from your guests, and that to comprise what I've learned from my guests. I mean, I've written a book about it, and I still don't think I've fully answered the question of what I've learned from them. I think the really big thing, right, is that, as an interviewer, your life is almost entirely driven by questions, not answers. And so I think that what it's taught me is not to simply accept everything that I've been told at face value, because that's what I did for so much of my life. You get this script that says, stick to straight and narrow, well-lit paths, follow the rules, don't make too much of a ruckus, obey your elders, climb the corporate ladder. Like, this is kind of the sort of standard narrative for success. And it's not that those things are necessarily bad or that they lead to a very terrible life, but they give you a very limited perspective on what's possible. And I think that what the biggest thing that all these conversations have done for me is that they have expanded my sense of what is possible. They've expanded my sense of possibility. And they've caused me, I think, to, really kind of conduct an ongoing inquiry, which I believe, if you're really a creative professional, or if you're a creative or an artist of any kind, that inquiry is not, a one-time thing. It's not a one-year thing. It's not a sort of artist in residence. I'm going to go and camp out in a cabin in the woods and conduct deep inquiry until I come out of, the whole thing enlightened like a Zen Buddhist on ecstasy. But it's a lifelong commitment and a lifelong process of conducting this ongoing inquiry about what it means to live a rich, fulfilling, meaningful, creative life. Because I think that what that looks like also continually evolves. Your values evolve, your desire for what you want to see exist evolves. I think maybe the bigger sort of lesson here is we started out in 2009 as a podcast for bloggers called Blogcast FM. And, a lot of the work was centered around online marketing. How do you grow an audience? How do you do this and that? And something shifted internally. One of the big things that shifted was I met a friend named AJ Leon, who runs a design agency called Misfit Inc. And I saw something very different in the way that he went about making his work. It felt much more artistic and much more beautiful. Like everything, when you were touched by the work that these guys did, you walked away from it feeling something. And I couldn't say that about a lot of sort of standard work that I had seen. And I couldn't say that about my own work. I was like, wow, we teach people how to grow traffic and increase numbers and increase metrics. And to be quite candid, I find this really mind-numbing. I'm actually not that interested in any of this. It's nice because it's educated me on tactics, but I don't want to teach tactics. I think that to me, what's far more interesting is telling stories. I don't want to give people a map. I want to give them a compass and allow them to draw their own map, because when they draw their own map, the results are far more interesting. So rather than giving people a place where they could replicate the success of the people that they've heard, I gave them a place where they could borrow ideas from some of the people that they've heard and create their own version of what it means to be unmistakable. And so that's a big one. I think understanding what it is that your own values are and what you want to see exist in the world is critically important, because the thing is that, and again, I'll go back to Neil Gaiman. One of the things that he said is when you do this kind of work, at least, no matter how it turns out, at least you'll have the work. Yeah. He said anytime he did something where it was solely for the money or some sort of external accolade, he regretted, having done it. And somehow the universe kicks you in the ass and tells you that, this just isn't going to work. And so that's, I think that's really probably one of the biggest things I've learned. And here's the interesting sort of paradox or strange thing about this, right, is we're talking about comparison. And yet, I think the great challenge I face on a regular basis is how do you interview and talk to all these very successful and sort of outlier type people, and at the same time not compare yourself to them. One of my mentors said, he said, your entire sort of narrative for what success looks like is kind of warped, and it's all defined by unusual outliers and people who are exceptional. He said, and that's just not normal.
It's also interesting you just picking up on Neil's take. We had Amanda Palmer on the show a while back, and you mentioned that the mark not wanting to, when you start the podcast, not wanting to teach tactics, and I completely get that part as well. And I've always been kind of intrigued that there seems to be these two different camps in the marketing. And this isn't obviously a full discussion about marketing, but just to kind of like talk what you were kind of about being kind of remarkable what you're doing and being unmistakable. There seems to be that camp of the very technical type of marketers where they're doing it's ad traffic and it's numbers and it's about doing big numbers, and that's how they do it. And then there seems to be at the opposite end the cool kids with the cool haircuts and the Snapchat and everything else that's kind of going on as well. And what I think about someone like Amanda and Neil as well is that they tread this middle line. They use these tools for what they're possible to be used, but in service of their own characters, and it's just an extension of themselves. And I think that's actually a really hard thing to do. When I would imagine you're being bombarded with comparisons of like, well, the only way to do it is like sound like you're hustling all the time, or that it's that. And I imagine a lot of people that listen to your show, they may be having that same kind of challenge. They're hearing different things, and so how do you kind of, because you come from that world, you come from understanding marketing, but you also come from a deep place of being a writer, being a speaker, being a podcast host as well, and speaking to these incredible people. How do you kind of figure that stuff out in your head about where the line is?
Yeah, I think that's a wise observation, and I'm glad you brought up Amanda and Neil. And there is that sort of middle ground of a line where, like, I'm not going so far as to say that these things aren't important, right? Like, because you have to have some way to measure whether what you're doing is working. And the problem is that when your entire sort of world is driven by measurement, you end up doing things that you're not necessarily proud of. And so I think it's really, like you said, it's finding a balance. So, we absolutely measure everything. Like we have a weekly spreadsheet. Luckily, I'm not the one who has to do any of that because I find it really annoying and I'm not good at it. But I also know that if we don't do those things, we don't get the results that we're looking for. So it is important. I think the challenge I think a lot of creative people face is they go so far to the other extreme that, their work just gets sort of buried and nobody hears about it. Nobody sees it. So it's like you said, it's a delicate balance. And what that balance looks like, I don't necessarily know that I have the answer. I have the answer that works for me. I don't know that the answer that works for me works for everybody. So, you can go, there's two ways to approach this. I can go in and I can check the number of books we've sold every single day, or I can check it once a week. If I check it every single day, I'm kind of like, okay, this is going to drive me crazy. I know because I've done that. And, despite the fact that I write about this stuff, somebody jokingly said to me that often we write about the things that we struggle with the most. I struggle with it. I have a hard time. But here's one way to think about it, right, is that you get there's this other extreme where people are so focused on their metrics that's all they do is they spend all day checking their metrics. And it's kind of like, well, checking your metrics constantly doesn't cause them to change. Doing the things that causes them to change is what causes them to change.
So they get that paralysis by analysis type of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So I would imagine with interviewing all these people that you've interviewed, that's a great source of inspiration for you, for your books, your speaking, for the other things that you're doing as well. Where else do you go to fill up that to ignite that curiosity that you have? Because you could say, well, those interviews alone would be like you're filling up the bank constantly. But are there other places that you go and other ways you can tap into that curiosity for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we talked briefly before we hit record here about the fact that I'm an avid surfer. And, it's funny because I think at the heart of almost every creative endeavor, you'll find people who have some sort of physical activity that fuels it, right? It's not uncommon to find a lot of highly creative people that are runners. There's an amazing book by Haruki Murakami, which is called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. Yeah. And, when I read it, I thought, okay, this makes so much sense to me. And I have this deep appreciation for this book because, I could write literally the same book title and title it What I Talk About When I Talk About Surfing. And it would sound almost identical to his book. But there were so many parallels. But I think one of the interesting things about physical activities is, one, they allow for a disconnect, which we need in an age when we're just completely bombarded with information and, like you're constantly connected and, you're online staring at a screen from 8 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock in the evening. Some people even longer than that, and that's I don't think human beings have evolved like biologically to even deal with that. I mean, there's been a lot written about this by scientists and other people. So that's that. I think the unplug is critically important. I think one of the things that I would say, and part of the reason surfing appeals to me, as well as other board sports, two things. One, my parents wouldn't buy me a skateboard as a kid, so I guess there's a psychological and pathological need to do anything that involves tying a board to my feet and going at high speeds. And so, but I think if anything, what it's taught me is that physical risk, I think prepares you for creative risk. In fact, there's a quote that I wrote about this that I put on Instagram. I'm going to pull it up really quick because it was one of the things that I think really will answer your question about sort of the role that surfing plays in all of this.
And it sounds like when you got into surfing, you went all in to surfing. It wasn't it sounds like it was a pretty kind of full-on way to go into a sport.
Yeah, I would say so, but I had some very unusual circumstances that facilitated it. One, I graduated business school without a job, and I happened to be in business school in Malibu and, close to the ocean. And surfing happens to be a fantastic hobby for an unemployed person because it takes up a shitload of time and it doesn't cost any money. But here's I think a quote that really sums it up. I'd written this in a notebook the other day. Deep immersion in a physical activity allows the mind to quiet and at the same time hear our truest voice and connect with our heart's deepest desire. The most intense physical activities can take us into a place of solitude and contemplation we can never get sitting in a room in silence. Taking physical risks, it seems, equips us to take creative ones.
It's interesting. So you mentioned that word risk, taking, being able to kind of almost like develop your confidence in some way, because risk, it seems to be that is quite related to confidence to a certain extent. So does it also, when you're surfing, Is it a calming thing for the mind? Does it allow you basically just to kind of drop that an overthinking thing? Is that part of it?
Yeah. I mean, that is a big part of why I'm so addicted to it, is because it teaches you presence. When you drop into a wave, pretty much everything in your mind gets erased. It's a very unusual and surreal feeling. Like I don't think that I had ever truly experienced what it meant to be present until I became a surfer. And we talk a lot about flow and creativity. I think surfing teaches you how to get into states of flow. Like I think to me, it's access to a higher state of consciousness is the way I would describe it. And, flow is definitely a higher state of consciousness. And any creative person who has sat down and, you're a musician, so I'm sure you know this, like when you get into the groove, when you've been either practicing or when you're performing or when you're on a stage, there's a point at which action and awareness merge, and you don't really have to think about what you're doing. It's almost automatic. Funny enough, we haven't talked about this, even though you're a musician. Another place that I learned a lot about creativity is that I was a musician. I played the tuba for 9 years. I got into the USC School of Music. Indian parents were like, no, you're not going to be a career after this.
Business skill.
Rightfully so. I mean, being a tuba player is not the most demanding thing in the world, because you have to wait for somebody to die for a job to open up. Yeah. Because there's one in every orchestra. But the thing is that you get to a point in any sort of practice, even creatively, like even in my daily writing practice, there is a point where it will tip. Like I will find myself, saying things and doing things. So I've been working on a book right now, as I mentioned to you before we hit record, and it's a book that's all about creative habits and how do you sustain high quality creative output on a regular basis. And to be honest, for the first time in a very, very long time, I'm struggling. And today, for the first time, I kind of broke through, and I thought, wait a minute, this is going to work. Like I'm not, and with every book, I think I start with the same narrative. And it's funny because the intro to the book is all about how I finished a 45,000 word manuscript in 6 months. And I'm kind of like still, consumed by that debilitating narrative that I started that previous book with. Like, how the hell are we actually going to finish this thing? But what happens, I think, is, sorry, let me, So what happens is basically, Stephen Kotler had a great way of explaining this. He said flow follows focus. And so to tie it all back to surfing, you are forced into deep immersion in a physical activity. And as a result, I think forced into a state of flow and a higher state of consciousness.
So something which going back to the kind of confidence, I was recently looking through a whole bunch of testimonials, reviews of some of the most common books, the most popular books on creativity, and just kind of looking for themes and things that were kind of coming out, and confidence came through very strongly on that. And then looking at the ones that specifically about people that were interested in writing as a just for either personal pleasure or for a career in some way, there was that thing of saying, well, a book like this has already been written. I didn't want to write this thing because someone has already written it, but better or differently, or what else can I say? So the creative habits is an interesting one, because obviously there's been I can't remember the gentleman. There was a gentleman who writes for LA Times, wrote one a few years ago, which was very good. And then I know Maria Popova at Brain Pickings is very interested in this area, and I think Tim Ferriss has got something as well. So when you're coming up and you this is the overall area, creative habits and routines and things. Where do you go to be able to find a place, where you can be unmistakable in this area? Because you can. That's a
good question.
As an outsider, for me, just looking inside, I thought, has everything been written about creative habits?
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir. I mean, and in fact, this was the ongoing discussion with both my agent, agent, editor, and my writing coach. We're like, okay, how are we going to do this differently? I think here's what I would say about that. First, let's look at it at a very general, sort of broad level. Everything has already been said, but nobody has said it in the way that you're going to say it, I think is one thing to think about. And of course, you borrow from multiple people. I don't remember who told me this. Somebody said, when you borrow from one person, it's plagiarism. When you borrow from multiple people, it's creativity, or something along those lines. And so, inevitably, like, there's no way that I can write a book like this without referencing other people's work. But I think my own own sort of body of work also has lots of revealing things in it. The things that I've done, as a byproduct of creating Unmistakable Creative. So I've had a chance to look at creativity through so many different lenses, right? You don't necessarily think of a bank robber becoming a talking head on the criminal justice system as a necessarily creative act. Like, you wouldn't hear about something like that in a book about creative habits, but there is something very creative about that, right? There's something very creative about somebody saying, okay, these are my life circumstances. What can I do with them to make them worthwhile or make something valuable out of them? So I think that, the question of how do you say what hasn't been said before is a tough one, and I don't know that I have the exact answer to it. But I think it's trusting in your own opinion and trusting your own instinct and trusting, sort of your own level of authority that you have on the subject to, say, okay, yeah, what I have to say about this is worthwhile. And, I've been fortunate in that I've had a pretty solid testing ground. I'm a pretty prolific writer on the platform Medium, where, a lot of my posts get thousands of views. So I know for a fact that, okay, I've got something to say on this subject that is striking a chord, that is resonating in a way that people actually want to read this, that they're interested in these specific areas and they're interested in the way that I am writing about them. So
you're almost like creating that minimum viable product in those Medium articles, and you're sensing, oh, this is resonating with my audience, which is like Ryan Holiday and folks like that. They talk about this a lot, which is, I think is great, and which, I kind of feel sorry for people in the past that didn't have this ability to like just kind of test, where there's something, and they would write this huge opus. And then it would be, crickets as well, because they just didn't know if it had a fit with the folks they wanted to get. So you're we spoke just about the start there, this danger of comparing our backstage to someone else's front stage.
Yep.
And that comparison thing. So from outside, people kind of watching you and these successful books and the podcast and speaking and things. But can you tell us about a time when you worked on a creative project, you gave it your heart and your soul, but for whatever reason it just didn't work out like you'd hoped? And more importantly, what were the lessons you took from that experience?
Yeah. So in 2014, we did a live event called the Instigator Experience, where it was, 9 speakers, 60 attendees, application only. And it was just a blowout success. Like, it was everything that I had hoped it would be. People walked away from it inspired. The level of creativity, the artwork that got made for it, all of it. I mean, we're talking custom illustrating every name tag, movie trailers to open the event. The kinds of stuff, it's one of those things in my life that I look at, and it's one of the things in my body of work that I'm probably most proud of, because I know how much work went into it, and I know what a gargantuan effort it was. And, when we did the 2014 one, the hope was that this would be a annual event. Long story short, the rest of 2014 was pretty much just an abysmal disaster, for reasons that I won't bore you with. But, the thing is, as we're going into the end of 2014, we started to hopefully plan for a second Instigator Experience. We picked our speakers, but there were so many mistakes made, and, we launched during Christmas, and, applications weren't coming in. The first time around, we had more applications than we knew what to do with, because there were only 60 attendees. We got up, I think, 150 or 160 applications for 60 spots. So within the first day, it was very clear that we were going to succeed. Like, we knew the morning we opened applications, we're like, okay, we've got no problem here. This is gonna sell out. It sold out in 2 or 3 weeks. And, at the end of December 2014, we're kind of like, wow, we've gotten 10 applications, and this thing has to sell out. Otherwise, we're going to lose so much money. And so we basically, I think, we tried to salvage it. We said, okay, the week after Christmas, our speakers will do emails to their lists. Some people couldn't do it until February or March. And we're like, well, that's just not possible, considering the event is in April. And so I think by the time it was probably the second week of January, the first week of January, we had to pull the plug, because we started just doing the math. And, one of my mentors said, you'll recover from canceling an event and pissing off a few speakers and, screwing over a few people's schedules, and we refunded everybody's money, anybody who had paid. And, but he said, recovering from being $50,000 in debt, that's going to be a lot harder to recover from. It's the kind of thing where, like, it could put you out of business. There's a couple of things learned from that. One is, don't ever launch an $1,800, ticket event in the middle of the holiday season when nobody has any money because they're spending it all. Two, the other thing that changed was that this event, the second version of this event, was almost entirely driven not by my own insight and own input, but by the input of other people, even, namely a mentor and, a partner who actually ended up not staying with us. And I didn't trust my own instincts and my own opinions in that process. And so it was no longer my vision. Like, the vision had been compromised, I think. I personally, it's possible that the people who actually played a role in that vision would disagree with what I'm saying. But I actually think the fact that we compromised on the vision also caused the event to fall apart. But the other thing is that it wasn't just that. We had lost a lot of the momentum that we had from the earlier part of the year, because I dealt with a lot of personal issues between the first event and the end of the year. So I would say the biggest lessons are creative momentum is very powerful. Losing it is incredibly toxic. Getting it back is a lot of work. If you happen to be in a space of momentum when things are going really well, the natural temptation is to relax a bit and coast. But I think there's no better time to put your foot on the gas pedal, because one of the most valuable lessons that the same mentor who helped plan this event the first time taught me was that when you're in what he called the momentum window, you have an opportunity to make a quantum leap. And when you make those kinds of leap, you'll never be back down to the same level again. Which is why I think, you put the gas, on your foot on the gas pedal in moments of momentum. Like, I ended up submitting my manuscript for my first book, I think in February of this year, or January, and I got to work immediately on, a substantial body of work on Medium related to the material I knew I would be writing about for the second book. So, I never stopped writing 1,000 words a day. That's still what I do. So momentum is one of them. Values and vision, I think, are the other big lesson. Don't compromise on your values or the vision of what you want to see exist just because a bunch of other people are insisting on something being a certain way. In their insistence, I think we ruined, what the event should have been. And then the other thing is that I think you kind of go back to Seth Godin's sort of mantra: this might not work. That's always the case, and people have, asked and asked and asked, and they're like, are you guys planning on doing another one? I really want to come if you do. And my answer has consistently been no. I'm not. It's made me gun shy because of what a disaster the failure was. Like, I haven't gotten. I'm not sure I've entirely gotten over it yet. Like, I haven't gotten to the point where I'm comfortable taking that big a risk.
It's interesting. I mean, those. And thank you for sharing that as well, because our team here, we organize these kind of retreats, these creative retreats in different parts of the world, and they're great fun, but they also can be hugely exhausting in the preparation, and once you're doing the event as well. And the one thing I would say, and this is, I'm not a writer, so this is kind of, I can't really speak to the writing side, but something I often feel when I go and hear someone speak at an event, I think speaking is an amazing ability for someone to be able to be a great speaker at an event or a keynote or something, just to get that spark, that inspiration going. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the really deep work, I think, happens in either those live events, those live experiences, or actually I think still books. Mm-hmm. I think there's something as low tech as a book is, in mm-hmm. terms of being transformational for people. I've heard more people say that they were transformed by especially non-fiction book or attending an event than I necessarily have of people going and hearing a speaker, even a great speaker. It might have moved them in a particular way and jolt them to do something, or to go and follow up and read a book, or go to a longer event. But I would say, please don't give up on the idea of doing events, because for your audience, I'm sure that it fulfills an extremely powerful role in their lives, and you can obviously impact them in a different way than books.
Yeah, no, I'm aware of that, and it's one of those things that the way we do it is incredibly exhausting. But I realize that if we're going to do it, it's going to be one of those sort of once every 4 years, and when we do it, we'll do it big, and it won't. It's something we do we don't do it regularly, so you better get on board. Yeah, like to create not an artificial sense of demand, but to say, look, this is the reality. We don't do this often, mainly because I jokingly refer to it as the wedding without the wife at the end of it. But, and the thing is, you can do, like, we could do, somebody told me once, it was a friend, and then we were talking, she said, Srini, she's like, you don't have to go all out and do it this way. And I completely disagree with that. I think there's no point in doing it if you're not going to do it that way.
Yeah, you don't want to leave anything off. So yeah, this creative journey you've had, this fascinating life you've had so far, you obviously decided, I'm not going to go down the traditional post-MBA life, which you could have absolutely have done. You chose a different journey, a different creative path. And in this journey you've gone through, can you tell us about a kind of key insight in your life when you made some kind of new distinction, or you just, it's this light bulb just kind of occurred to you where you thought, okay, this is the direction I need to be going with my work, with my writing, with my speaking. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I think there are two that I think are probably worth mentioning. First, I briefly alluded to earlier is when I met, my friend AJ Leon, and I kind of saw that, he really, everything about the way he approached his work was much more like an artist and less like a marketer, right? To me, that was inspiring, and I wanted my work to be that way. And I wanted to create the kind of work that people couldn't help but talk about because it inspired them. But more than that, I wanted it to inspire me. And I kind of was like, wow, my own work doesn't inspire me at a level that, other people's does. And I want to change that. So that's a big one, is thinking a lot more like an artist and less like a marketer. But, I think the sort of underlying thread that made me come to the most profound realization, and I have to remind myself of this on a daily basis because it's difficult. I was, as I mentioned to you, at a 1-year-old's birthday party, and it's always amusing, especially when you talk to old Indian people, because to them, I'm living a life and having a career that makes absolutely no sense. They can't make sense. It doesn't fit into their sort of box or model of the world of, are you a doctor? Are you doing your residency? Are you an engineer? Are you working at a company? Then if not, what the hell are you doing? I think I was just writing about this morning. Danny Shapiro, who wrote the book Still Writing, has this really hilarious line here. In fact, I'll read it to you because I think it's that, it was one of those things where, it's such an odd thing. This is her quote. I've thought of all the times I've been asked if I'm still writing. I've been asked this by acquaintances, strangers, and even by fans, readers of mine. Still writing. It always felt to me like a shameful thing that I was being asked this, that surely if I had written more books, won more awards, and made more money, was better known, I wouldn't be dealing with the question still writing. And, I think the thing that makes me realize is that, I'll have these very uncomfortable conversations with, sort of elders in our community who can't make sense of it. And, even though I've done so much more, the usual question is, oh, still blogging? And I'm like, you don't ask people, are they still engineering? Are they still doing surgery? That's like asking somebody, do you still go to work every day? Yeah. But to them, this isn't work. It's a bit to the idea that, and I wrote this, I said, to call it a real job, real work is hard for most people to get their heads around. The idea that the books on the shelf in a Barnes and Noble or at the library are written by people who spend their days on end sitting in a quiet room tapping away at a keyboard is a bit like telling these people that Santa Claus isn't real. So, I think the sort of bigger message behind all of this is that I came to a realization that, despite all the things that all of these people say that, make me doubt myself and make me question the path at times, you have to remind yourself that, the people who in your life are happy to solicit, to bombard you with their opinions and their attitudes, they're not the ones who are going to deal with the consequences of the choices that you make and the life that you live as a result of what you do.
Yeah, they don't have any skin in the game.
No, they don't. Yeah, it's easy to sit down and it's very easy to offer advice when you have no skin in the game. Yeah, that's a way to think of it.
So you obviously, this next book you're writing is all about habits. Can you share a personal habit, maybe a keystone habit that you have that you think contributes to your success as a writer?
For sure. I'll actually share, I think maybe my daily routine. I think that'll be more helpful because if I give you the habit itself without context, it won't make any sense. Is that cool?
Perfect.
So basically, I have a pretty rigid routine that I follow. And, I have to credit a few people for this. Scott Adams talks about, systems versus goals. Like the thing is goals, so many of the goals are outcome driven and the outcomes are out of our control. Like let's say I set a goal to get, 1,000 people reading something. I have no control over whether that actually happens. But what I do have control over is the 1,000 words that I write. So a couple of things that I do. One thing I do is it all actually begins the night before. I block distractions. So this morning, morning, I knew I was going to be talking to you at 10. And I thought, okay, you know what? I wake up at 6. I want 4 hours of uninterrupted time with, no email, no Slack, no social media. So I use a tool called Hey Focus, and I block everything for 14 hours the night before. So that way I don't have access to email or social media until 11 o'clock in the morning. So that makes for no ability to waste your time on stuff that is of low value. Then, a couple of other things I do is I set books out on my desk the night before. I set my Moleskine as well as the book that I'm going to start the day with to read. Right now I have a new book by Ryan Holiday called The Daily Stoic, which is all about Stoic meditations. Like, he's basically made the entire sort of library of Stoic philosophy accessible in these daily, pieces in a book form, which is fantastic and I love. And then, I'll pick a book off the shelf and I'll also put my Moleskine. So, the reason I do this is it's based on a principle from psychology called activation energy, which I learned about in Sean Acor's book, The Happiness Advantage. And the idea behind activation energy is fairly straightforward is, for the things that you want to do, you reduce the activation energy. For the things you want to avoid, you increase the activation energy. So just the fact that you don't have to go get the book off the shelf or, you go put your, get your notebook off your shelf makes you that much more likely to write because it's right there when you sit down in the morning. Then I read for about 30 minutes. I write in a physical notebook for, anywhere between 20 minutes to a half hour, depending on kind of what shows up. If I hit it, get it, start knocking it out of the park, I'm kind of like, okay, let me just keep going. I use an app called Focus at Will, where I put on noise cancellation headphones and I, have that on while I'm writing. And then I write for about an hour or two. I write 1,000 words. Some days I'll go past 1,000 words. So one thing that I'm finding interesting about the 1,000 words is because I've done it so much at this point, it no longer challenges me at the level that it once did. So now I have to actually push past 1,000 to get into sort of a state of flow and to actually write things that are worth reading. But that being said, a good amount of what I write is not worth reading. It's really the idea that is very much like Julia Cameron's morning pages, not to censor yourself, but simply to fill the page. So I'm not necessarily making a deliberate effort to try to write something brilliant, but in that process, often, I find that it's very sort of cleansing. It's kind of like a tool that I depend on. And often many of my insights about what I want to include in a book, what I want to write as an article, all come from that process of 1,000 words a day. After that, I typically will do editing for podcasts. I still do some of the editing of our podcast. There are certain things that I can't outsource yet. And then, I try not to schedule too much stuff later in the afternoon, after 3 o'clock. I also play video games. I happen to be a strangely weird person who plays sports games but can't stand watching sports on TV. And that's really kind of in a nutshell my daily routine. And I exercise every morning. I hit the gym for about 45 minutes too. So on the days that I don't surf.
And that's when you were just talking there about that kind of morning schedule and just kind of basically setting yourself up to win the night before, and those kind of activation energies as well. And I've heard other people do this, especially obviously around music, where they will have the violin or the guitar set up there, totally in the middle of the living room, so they can't not play it as well. And so that's obviously like creating these little, I don't know whether they're hacks or just like things that are obviously going to make it simple for you to win in that way as well.
Exactly.
So you mentioned on the writing. So you've done your morning pages, and then you may be kind of sitting down to do some are you writing at a laptop most of the time, or are you editing?
Yeah, I use laptop, and I forgot to mention I use distraction-free writing software. So the writing software does nothing other than write. It's just a text editor. And
then when you're writing, are you just going in and you're writing the thing that is taking where your head is at that morning, or you?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I will usually the morning. The first half of the writing session is whatever comes to my mind. There's no necessary sort of okay, I'm trying specifically to get this writing to lead to some sort of outcome.
Okay. So in this 24-hour, let's take out the sleeping bit. If you were to that 4 hours that you maybe currently have for the free writing and then writing and editing podcasts and things, if you were only able to do an hour instead of 4 hours, what would the hour then consist of?
I think the hour would be 1,000 words a day. In fact, I wrote a piece on Medium titled "The Power of One Focused Hour a Day," because again, people underestimate the value of consistency. Like, yeah, I get 4 hours because I do this, but like, a lot of people, you don't have to do 4 hours. You could do 1 hour a day, 6 days a week, and you'd be amazed at the amount of momentum that would result in. I mean, that's how I started. Like, my ability to do it has stretched because I've done it so much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for kind of sharing that with our listeners as well, those kind of daily habits and that system you have in place. Before we could start to finish up here, I'd like to ask one question. We haven't spoke so much about your team, and you kind of alluded to some things you outsource and stuff, and obviously you have a creative team around you, I think with Brian and Derek. Yep. There. What do they allow you to achieve creatively that you don't think you could necessarily do on your own?
Well, I think the fact that they work on managing the finances so that I can focus almost entirely on the truly creative work, like finding our guests, working on books. I think they free me up from sort of worrying about sort of optimization, like all the sort of things we talked about earlier, like measurement and metrics. We've got Derek for that. Brian is primarily responsible for sales and dealing with sponsors and advertisers and all of that. So that gives me sort of free reign to focus pretty much entirely on the audience and building community, and more than anything, creating content, which is kind of what our entire sort of, business is driven by. And
then you mentioned, like, when you were doing that live event, the thing that you kind of felt got away from you was the vision, your initial vision as well. With a small team like that, are there things that you kind of do to kind of keep the vision kind of core to what you're doing, and as a reminder?
I think that we've realized if fortunately, like, it's funny because technically now I'm CEO of the company, even though Brian is president of the company, but he said your vision is what drives this, and I think what we've done is we've made a concerted effort to say, okay, is this anything we do, I'm like, is this in line with our vision? Is this in line with who we want to be? Is this something we'd be proud to put our signature on? Is this something that when we've created it, we'll be like, yeah, we created that, we think it made a difference, we're proud of it no matter how it turns out. I think when we first started working together, Brian had a very sort of strange approach to this. He said, create what's in your heart. We'll figure out what to do with it, which, not exactly sound business advice per se, but it worked and it was necessary to get me back to that place of trusting my own instincts.
But it's also probably what a good artist manager would say as well.
Yeah.
Exactly. So as we kind of start to finish up, if you could recommend just one record and one book to our listeners, what would they be?
So I will reference the book. Actually, here's a book that I think is a very important book, and I want the book to spread because I felt it was important, and I don't feel that enough people know about it. It's called The New Better Off: Reinventing the American Dream by Courtney Martin. And it hasn't been wildly popular yet, but I think it is probably the most important book that's been written this year. And it's all about sort of looking at values and creativity and all of this stuff through a number of different lenses. And to me, that's the book. Record, I will probably be totally cliche, but Michael Jackson's Thriller, because that was the first tape. That was the first piece of music that I ever was exposed to, and I played it. And this was, you might be old enough, James, to remember this. There was a time when we had these things called Walkman.
Yes, I remember those. Yeah.
And so I played it until the tape stopped working. It wasn't like a CD where you could play it over and over again. So yeah, that was one of those albums that influenced my life. I do remember that.
I remember that you had to get the pencil in the tape if you wanted to like rewind it, and it was, all the things that unfortunately millennials are going to thankfully don't have to deal with now because they've got Spotify.
Yeah.
So finally, the last question. Let's imagine you woke up tomorrow morning, had to start from scratch. So you've got all the tools of your trade, you've got the skills, the chops as a writer that you've developed, as an interviewer that you've acquired, but you have no contacts. No one knows who in the hell you are. Yeah. You've got to restart. How would you do it?
Boy, that's an interesting question because, I've been, I guess in some ways that's very similar to the question of what would you do differently. And it's a hard question to answer because, I don't know that I would do anything differently because if I did things differently, I wouldn't know what I know. So that being said, I think above all things, I would have just a consistent schedule, and my expectations would be very different. Like I would temper my expectations and get comfortable with the fact that this is going to take way longer than I think it is.
Very good advice. Well, thank you, Srini, for coming on the show. What is the best way that listeners can connect with you, learn more about your show, your podcast, and the books?
Yeah, so you can find the podcast in iTunes if you just do a search for Unmistakable Creative. You can, visit our website at unmistakablecreative.com. And then the book, Unmistakable Why Only is Better Than Best, is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Audible.
Fantastic. And we'll put all the links at jamestaylor.me so anyone can go to there as well. And Srini, I wish you all the best also with the new book that you're probably in the process of starting to write now as well. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.